Back, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Taylor Greene, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for up to 5 minutes and advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the commission to study the events of January 6th, as well as spending $2 billion in security supplemental. The question that comes to mind is this: what about all the riots that happened during the summer of 2020 after the death of George Floyd? What about all the damage caused to federal buildings, churches, people's businesses, and innocent people that were killed, like David Dorn? This past summer, Minneapolis city officials estimate 700 buildings were damaged, burned, or destroyed, including 360 local businesses. Riots caused an estimated $55 million in damages in Minneapolis alone. BLM and Antifa established an autonomous zone in Seattle and attempted to burn government buildings in Portland. Is that not an insurrection? On one Friday night alone in New York City, BLM protesters caused over $100,000 in damages and 150 people were arrested. Just one Monday night in Philadelphia resulted in a crowd of 1,000 people looting stores, setting fires in the middle of the street, and 30 police officers injured. Protests in Kansas City resulted in $2.1 million in damages, mostly over the course of one weekend. Several officers were injured as well. Protests in Wichita, Kansas cost the police department about $1.5 million in overtime. Protests in Salt Lake City cost at least $100,000 in damages. Protests in Denver cost the city at least $5.5 million in damages and overtime. BLM protests in Nashville set a federal courthouse on fire. The destruction is estimated to have cost $1.2 million in damages. Again, is that an insurrection? Protesters in Portland destroyed barriers and attempted to burn down government buildings, resulting in $2.3 million in damages, including $1.6 million in damages to the courthouse downtown. In St. Louis, following the night of violence, buildings were looted, vandalized, and burned. Protesters in Louisville set the courthouse on fire and shot 2 cops, resulting in a state of emergency ordered being declared. Protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, injured. Police officers set off fireworks near the building and courthouse and set at least 2 city trucks on fire. In Guilford County, North Carolina, a courthouse was broken into, set on fire, resulting in roughly $200,000 in damages. Protests in Oakland, California, resulted in a courthouse being set on fire and vandalized. The LAPD was defunded by $150 million, and some smaller crime units were eliminated entirely. Studies show 570 protests in 220 U.S. locations turned violent over the summer. Are those not insurrections? The $1+ billion in riot damage is estimated to be the most expensive in insurance history. It resulted in up to $2 billion of damages in 20 cities across the U.S., mostly concentrated in LA, Detroit, Miami, D.C., and New York. Indeed, we should have a commission to study the violent BLM and Antifa mobs that have plagued American cities this past summer. And that's for the American people who, by the way, pay the taxes that fund everything we do here. Also, we should have a security supplemental to fund all the police departments that have been defunded due to the pressure from radical, violent, and socialist groups. We should back the blue because they certainly back us. Also, while it's catch and release for domestic terrorists, Antifa, BLM, the people who breached the Capitol on January 6th are being abused, some even being held for 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. So, Mr. Speaker, my questions are this. Who placed the pipe bombs at the RNC and the DNC, which is an attack on both Republicans and Democrats? Why was President Trump's request on January 5th for 10,000 National Guard denied? And who denied it? And what chain of command did they follow? Also, who killed Ashley Babbitt? And why is that not being revealed? Does her family not deserve justice? And lastly, when will the witch hunt of Donald J. Trump come to an end and all of those who support him? I rest the rest of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to address the House for 5 minutes and to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad are doing to Israel is nothing short of evil and barbaric. Even worse, some of my colleagues across the aisle and in the national media are excusing this violence against our closest ally in the Middle East. It is a fact that Hamas and the PIJ if they were to lay down their weapons, there would be peace. But if the Israelis laid down theirs, they would be exterminated. There's no secret because these two terrorist groups explicitly say their goal is to wipe Israel off the face of the map, and their actions back up their words, Mr. Speaker. I think a history lesson in global current affairs update is in order for the members of Congress and media organizations taking the side of terrorists intent on exterminating Israel and the entire Jewish population. For starters, nobody should forget that in 1997, it was President Bill Clinton's State Department that placed Hamas and the PIJ on the United States list of foreign terrorist organizations. Both groups are still on the list today, and for good reason. Israel removed their forces from the Gaza Strip in 2005, but in 2007, Hamas violently forced out Fatah in its rival Palestinian faction and consolidated its control of the entire Gaza Strip. A terrorist organization controlling territory within mere miles of the Jewish communities leaves Israeli civilians vulnerable to violent attacks, Mr. Speaker. Israel's military blockade protects its rightful homeland from infiltration by radical jihadi terrorists. The blockade is important for preventing the transfer of weapons from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which gives support to Hamas and PIJ. God only knows the devastation recent missile attacks would have inflicted on the Iranians if they were able to smuggle guided missiles into the Gaza Strip. Despite the blockade, Hamas and PIJ still construct their terror tunnels and manufacture their rockets with dual-use materials like concrete, steel, chemicals, fuel, and explosives, and many other things. These materials, which the Israelis allow to pass through their blockade, are meant for infrastructure in Gaza, only to wind up confiscated by the terrorists for their horrific attacks, Mr. Speaker. And if anybody questions the existence of the tunnels for their use, I recommend they go on the next Cadell to Israel to see for themselves. I've been there and stood in them, and they are, in fact, 100% real. This is a dilemma for Israel. They want to improve civilian life in Gaza by letting these important materials pass through its blockade, but they also know their enemies will steal these materials and try to harm Israelis. The violence that began last week came as a result of protests regarding an ongoing Israeli court order to evict Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, who is serving his 16th year of what is supposed to be a 4-year term, Mr. Speaker, called for unrest in the streets. Not to be outdone, Hamas and the PIJ recognized a political opportunity to assume the mantle as prosecutors of all Palestinian people, as protectors, excuse me. These terrorist groups responded by gutlessly and indiscriminately firing over 3,000 missiles since last Monday at hospitals, schools, and other civilian population centers across central and southern Israel. Thankfully, the United States provides Israel with generous military assistance for the Iron Dome and other missile defenses. The system has intercepted 90% of the missiles, 90%, Mr. Speaker. However, there have been 10 Israelis killed, including 2 children. Israel has a right to defend itself from unprovoked terrorist attacks from Hamas, PIJ, and anybody else. The Israelis responded forcefully, actively trying to limit civilian casualties by calling residents in targeted buildings and employing the knock-on-the-roof warnings. This is a courtesy terror groups like Hamas and PIJ do not and will never return. Without these important measures, Mr. Speaker, hundreds more Palestinian civilians would be dead because Hamas and PIJ use commercial and residential buildings to house their military operations and ammunition depots. This disgusting tactic is the reason why the Palestinian death toll is higher and why the lives of dozens of innocent Palestinian children have been lost. These terror groups are more than willing to use their own power their own people as human shields for the sake of vilifying Israel. And unfortunately, the most radical members of Congress and the American mainstream media have bought this narrative hook, line, and sinker, Mr. Speaker. Hamas and the PIJ are no friends of ours and want the same fate for Israel that so many terrorists want for the United States, the complete and total destruction of democracy. If you are going to blame Israel alone for the recent violence, you are being nothing more than a